When historians speak in hushed tones about the most corrupt, most depraved monarchs in European history, the name Ferdinand VII of Spain floats to the surface like an oil slick. Shiny, nauseating, impossible to ignore. His reign was a political disaster. But the story you're about to hear has almost nothing to do with parliamentary chambers or battlefields. Instead, it begins in the most private of royal spaces, the wedding bed. And it ends in a humiliation so grotesque that it would ripple through the corridors of the Spanish court for years. October 1819. The royal palace of Madrid stands draped in gold and candlelight. Servants in crisp uniforms scurry along marble corridors. Musicians play delicate minuets in distant salons, their notes drifting like perfumed air into the vast echo of the palace. In one chamber, however, there is no music, only the soft clink of a rosary in the trembling hand of a girl who has no idea what is about to happen to her. She is Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, just 16 years old. Until this moment, her life has been cloistered inside a convent, her world bounded by books and whispered prayers. She believes, truly believes, that babies are delivered by storks, a quaint fiction never corrected by her sheltered upbringing. Her German attendants, embarrassed and constrained by court etiquette, do not explain the facts of marriage to her. Instead, they dress her in a gown of white silk and pearls, place the rosary in her hand, and leave her alone in the cold opulence of the bridal chamber. The door opens, but the man who steps in is no fairy tale prince. Ferdinand is 35, bloated from years of indulgence, with the sallow skin of a man whose health is already in decline. His lips jut forward in an almost simian protrusion. His eyes glitter not with romance, but with something predatory. He carries with him the sour scent of wine, and a kind of heavy-breathed anticipation. Yet it is not his demeanor, nor his drunkenness, that freezes the young queen in horror. It is what she sees when his robe falls open. Ferdinand suffers from a condition rare enough that even modern medicine struggles to classify it: macrogenitosomia. In blunt terms, his genitals are monstrously oversized, but in a manner that defies the vulgar fantasies of tavern talk. They are grotesquely misshapen, thin and tapering at the base, then swelling into a fist-like mass at the end, unnaturally long, a form that seems less human than some medieval instrument of torture. French writer Prosper Mérimée, years later, would record a description from courtiers who saw it that night: thin as a sealing wax tape at the root, and as thick as a fist at the extremity, as long as a billiard cue. For Maria Josepha, raised in chastity and ignorance, the sight is incomprehensible. Then, comprehension begins to dawn, not in knowledge, but in a raw animal terror. She bolts in the bed like prey, clutching her skirts, rosary still tangled in her fingers. The king, heavy and gouty, lumbers after her, his face mottled with rage and drunken embarrassment. The scene is almost absurd. It weren't so charged with threat. A teenage girl darting around the chamber, a half-naked monarch grunting in pursuit. When she proves too quick for him, Ferdinand's humiliation boils over. He storms into the adjoining room, still entirely naked, and shouts at her attendants. His voice echoes against the gilded walls as he orders them to prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. Even in a court where royal whims were law, the command is chilling. These women, bound by duty and fear, are forced to attempt the impossible: to explain to a petrified child what is expected of her, knowing full well the things she will face. Whatever they say makes matters worse. When Ferdinand returns, the air in the room is heavy with dread. But before he can even touch her, another humiliation unfolds. Maria Josepha, her body racked by fear beyond her ability to control, has lost all command of her bowels. The wedding bed, intended to be a stage for the consummation of royal duty, is instead fouled with human waste. Ferdinand recoils, his face twisting in disgust. "Queens," he spits, "do not smell of civet." With that, he storms out, leaving behind a stinking tableau of fear, shame, and shattered ceremony. For more than a week, he will refuse to lay a hand on her, but the damage is already done. The Spanish court, always eager for scandal, whispers in every corridor. Foreign envoys, quick to scent weakness, will soon send their own embellished versions of the story across Europe. And yet, this was only the opening act. To understand why a royal wedding night, could turn so catastrophically wrong. We must step backward into the life of Ferdinand himself and uncover the truth about the monstrous secret he carried beneath those royal robes. It is a truth written not only in the private humiliations of his wives, but in the political destiny of a nation. To understand the grotesque disaster of that October night in 1819, one must first look back, years before Maria Josefa ever set foot in Madrid, to Ferdinand's earliest attempt at marriage. It was 1802, and the young Bourbon prince, then only 17, had been married off to his cousin Maria Antonia of Naples. The match was politically neat, tying together two powerful branches of European royalty. But behind the ornate wedding ceremonies and elaborate feasts lay a problem that neither diplomacy nor court protocol could solve. On their wedding night, Maria Antonia wrote to her mother in a letter that now rests in an archive under guarded lock. "The prince merely gawks at me, touches me as if I were a statue, and does nothing more." For 11 long months, the marriage went unconsummated. Each attempt followed the same awkward script. Ferdinand, aroused in a manner described by palace physicians as uncontrolled and unbalanced, would attempt to mount his wife, only to falter. The deformity he carried was not simply an oddity. It was an anatomical puzzle that rendered basic intercourse a near impossibility. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, sent increasingly urgent letters to Madrid, begging for intervention. "My daughter weeps nightly," she wrote. "The prince feels nothing. Attempts to instruct him are useless. This situation is extraordinary and unfortunate for whoever is at his side." Finally, in an act both humiliating and unprecedented, the royal confessor, a Catholic priest, was tasked with giving the future king explicit sexual instruction. What followed was a kind of tragic comedy of errors. Ferdinand's first success came nearly a year into the marriage, but triumph quickly turned to catastrophe. Maria Antonia suffered not one but 2 miscarriages, injuries so severe that her physicians whispered the cause was the king's own anatomy. In 1806, at just 21 years old, she died. The official cause was tuberculosis. Those who saw her in her final weeks believed otherwise, that her body had been broken in a bedchamber rather than on any battlefield of disease. Ferdinand emerged from that first marriage changed. Where once he had been clumsy and ignorant, he now became obsessed with the act itself, obsessed in a way that pushed past mere appetite into the realm of fixation. Freed from the bonds of matrimony after Maria Antonia's death, he began a descent into a private life so sordid it would rival the darkest rumors about Caligula. When he returned to power in 1814, after Napoleon's defeat and Spain's liberation from French control, Ferdinand was 30 years old, politically vindictive and sexually ravenous. The king began slipping out of the palace at night, shrouded in a dark cloak, his destination the seediest brothels in Madrid. His favorite was run by a madam known as Papal Malaguine, a place so infamous that respectable citizens crossed the street rather than pass its doors. But Ferdinand did not indulge in anonymity. He brought with him a cadre of young aristocrats, men as jaded and corrupt as their king, turning the red light district into a nightly theater of debauchery. Here, the deformity that had humiliated him in youth became his party trick. Witnesses recounted scenes in which Ferdinand, drunk on cheap wine, would challenge his companions to crude contests, exposing himself and demanding size comparisons. He always won. His entourage even gave him a nickname, El Bien de Dieu, the well-endowed one. Yet the real darkness lay not in the boasting, but in the trophies he collected. Ferdinand had developed a fetish as macabre as it was specific. He kept the blood-stained rags from the virgins he deflowered. These were not symbolic relics of dynastic purity. They were personal souvenirs, each one a reminder of conquest. He stored them away as others might store coins, paintings, or rare books. While his second wife would one day build a Prado museum, Ferdinand was building a private museum of far more grotesque kind. The pattern was chilling. These trophies did not come solely from prostitutes in Pipa's house. They came from widows, peasant girls, even palace servants, women who could not say no to a king. And though it was whispered quietly among courtiers, the truth was obvious. Ferdinand's sexual predation was as systematic as his political repression. When liberal reformers dared to challenge him, they might find themselves executed. When the men were gone, their daughters, sisters, or wives sometimes found themselves summoned to the palace, their audiences ending in the addition of another rag to his collection. In this way, the anatomy that had once made Ferdinand the laughingstock of European courts became a weapon. Physical proof of his control, his dominance, and a contempt for any boundary, moral or human. And it was only a matter of time before this private cruelty bled into the most public duty of a monarch, the creation of an heir. By 1816, Ferdinand's reign was already bleeding Spain dry, politically, financially, morally. The empire's grip on its American colonies was slipping. The economy was gasping for air, and liberal revolts were flaring like brush fires. Yet at court, a different crisis loomed large. The throne still had no heir. For a Bourbon monarch, the absence of successor was more than an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Dynasties were cemented in the nursery, not in the council chamber. Ferdinand's solution was, predictably, dynastic and close to home. He married his own niece, Maria Isabel Braganza, a 19-year-old Portuguese princess whose plain features and unadorned manners made her an easy target for Madrid's venomous court gossips. They whisper a rhyme behind her back. Feia, pobre y portuguesa, ugly, poor, and Portuguese. It was cruelty dressed as wit, the sort of social poison that only deepened her isolation. And yet, Maria Isabel had something Ferdinand sorely lacked: dignity. While her husband prowled the capital's brothels, she worked quietly to bring refinement to a court drowning in scandal. It was she who laid the foundations of the Prado Museum, who insisted the Royal Academy open its doors to women artists. She did not speak ill of the king, but neither did she hide from his neglect. By 1818, she was pregnant, a rare victory for the Bourbon bloodline, and for a moment, the court allowed itself a breath of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Labor began on a cold December night, and almost immediately, complications set in. The child was in breech position. Hours passed. Maria Isabel's strength began to ebb. In the palace's candlelit medical chamber, the royal physicians faced an unthinkable decision: save the mother or save the child. Ferdinand's command came without hesitation. Save the child, he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who saw his wife less as a partner than as a vessel. Cut her if you must. In the 21st century, an emergency cesarean is brutal enough. In 1818, it was a gamble with death. The tools were rudimentary, the air unsterilized, the only anesthesia a haze of alcohol and laudanum. They sliced open her abdomen, believing her unconscious. But halfway through, Maria Isabel's eyes flew open and a scream tore from her throat, a sound so raw and unearthly that the attending servants swore they heard echo in the stone hallways. She was awake as they cut through her womb. The surgeons froze for a heartbeat, then pressed on, their hands trembling. The baby was already gone, stillborn, lifeless, perhaps for hours. Maria Isabel's blood poured over the table, soaking the towels and the surgeon's cuffs. By dawn, she was dead. She was 21. Official bulletins spoke of complications. In the whispers of the court, the blame was laid at Ferdinand's feet. Some murmured that his deformity had caused internal damage during conception. Others, bolder still, claimed the stillbirth was a mark of his untreated syphilis, a souvenir from his endless nights in Madrid's back alleys. Whatever the truth, the political result was the same. The king still had no heir, and now another queen was gone. The loss did nothing to slow Ferdinand's descent. If anything, it hardened him. Spain's colonies continued to break away. Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and liberal reformers met the executioner's blade. At home, the king's courtship of vice only deepened, and yet, with every passing year, the pressure to produce an heir mounted. By the time Ferdinand turned his eye once more to marriage, his reputation was already a stain on the Bourbon name, and the next bride, young, devout, and tragically naive, would soon find herself caught in the same nightmare that haunted every woman who shared his bed. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony had been queen for barely a week when her marriage bed became a battlefield. After the infamous wedding night chase and the humiliating soiling of the royal sheets, Ferdinand kept his distance. An entire week of calculated absence that was as much about wounded pride as it was about strategy. When he finally returned, the young queen did not greet him with submission. She fought. What happened next became the stuff of palace legend. As Ferdinand approached her, she lashed out with surprising ferocity for a girl raised in the cloister. She bit, scratched, and even delivered a sharp, panicked kick to the king's grotesque genitals, a blow hard enough that he staggered back, clutching himself and cursing in a mix of Spanish blasphemy and drunken rage. The attendants heard his howl from the other side of the chamber door. For days, Ferdinand alternated between anger and disbelief. He was the king of Spain. His wife was his property. That she could deny him, not just once but repeatedly, was an affront to the natural order as he saw it. Yet brute force, it seemed, would get him nowhere. So he tried a different tactic. Patience. Every night, he came to her rooms. Every night, she clutched her rosary and prayed. Maria Josepha's greatest weapon was not strength, but ignorance. She truly believed, without irony, that babies came from storks. When Ferdinand attempted to explain the realities of conception, she accused him of trying to trick her into mortal sin. God would not create such a vile method of bringing life into the world, she told him, her voice firm, her knuckles white around the beads. You are testing my virtue with lies. Weeks passed, then months. In a palace that thrived on rumor, the whispers became deafening. The king who bragged of his conquests in brothels could not bed his own wife. Foreign ambassadors, ever alert to weaknesses, reported back to their governments. The Spanish throne was a marriage in name only. Finally, Ferdinand reached for his trump card. He wrote to the Pope himself. Pope Pius VII, an elderly Italian who had survived Napoleon's upheavals, must have blinked in disbelief when he read the letter. The King of Spain, Catholic monarch and self-proclaimed defender of the faith, was asking the Holy Father to convince his teenage wife to have sex with him. The Pope's reply, still preserved in the Vatican archives, was a masterclass in diplomatic discomfort. In flowing Latin, Pius VII reminded Maria Josepha that marital relations were not only permitted but required by God. Producing an heir, he wrote, was her sacred duty, a commandment that came from heaven itself. To refuse her husband was to refuse the will of the Almighty. Maria Josepha read the letter and agreed, but only on her terms. She would submit to God's will, she said, provided she could pray the entire rosary beforehand, keep her eyes closed during the act, and think of the Virgin Mary throughout, so that her soul would remain unstained. Thus began what courtiers would later describe as the most joyless union in royal history. Ferdinand, who once boasted of his sexual prowess and collected blood-stained trophies from his conquests, now lay beside his wife as she whispered Ave Maria, Grazia plena, with eyes squeezed shut. For a decade, this became their ritual. The king attempted to fulfill his duty while the queen retreated into prayer, her body still and unyielding. 10 years, no child, no heir, and for Ferdinand, each passing year was another reminder that his physical power over women could not conquer this one girl's stubborn, almost holy resistance. When Maria Josepha died in 1829 at the age of 25, officially of fever, though many whispered that the strain of her marriage had taken its toll, the court exhaled in unison. Ferdinand had failed again. 2 dead queens, one living but childless, and a kingdom still staring into the abyss of a succession crisis. He had one last chance, and this time he would choose a bride who was not an innocent, not ignorant, and, crucially, not unprepared for the monster she was marrying. When Maria Cristina of Bourbon, 2 Sicilies, arrived in Madrid in 1829, she already knew exactly what she was marrying into. At 23, she was beautiful in the polished, composed way of a woman who understood both her own value and the dangers of the game she was about to play. She was also Ferdinand's niece. Incest being one Bourbon tradition, he upheld without question. Unlike her predecessors, Maria Cristina did not arrive cloaked in naivety. She had studied the fates of the queens who came before her, and she understood that producing an heir in this marriage was not just political duty. It was a matter of personal survival. The challenge was not moral or emotional. It was mechanical. Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy had already destroyed one wife's body and kept another at arm's length for a decade. And by now, his physical condition was compounded by years of venereal disease, gout, and the ravages of his debauched lifestyle. Producing a living child was not simply a matter of lying back and letting nature take its course. It was an engineering problem. The solution came from an unlikely alliance between Maria Cristina and the royal physician, Dr. Antonio Hernandez. After reviewing Ferdinand's medical history and examining the king himself, a task few men in Europe would envy, Dr. Hernandez concluded that the problem was one of proportional incompatibility. In less clinical terms, the king's size, shape, and force made intercourse without injury nearly impossible. If they couldn't alter the tool, they would have to adapt the garden. From this reasoning emerged one of the strangest artifacts in the history of monarchy, a specially designed cushion, una almohadilla, crafted from the finest silk and stuffed with down. In its center was a precisely measured hole, for centimeters deep, calibrated to act as a barrier between Ferdinand and his queen. The device would limit penetration to only the tip, avoiding the internal damage that had plagued previous attempts at conception. Presenting such an object to the king required delicacy. Maria Cristina, ever the strategist, framed it not as an acknowledgement of his deformity, but as a medical necessity for the health of their future heirs. She appealed to Ferdinand's ego, casting him not as flawed, but as a man so uniquely endowed that extraordinary measures were needed to preserve the queen's well-being. Remarkably, it worked. Ferdinand agreed. Their first night using the device was awkward, almost ceremonial. The king, who once strutted naked through brothels boasting of his size, now had to accept a constraint, a literal boundary between himself and his partner. Maria Cristina treated the process like any other court protocol, calm, measured, and entirely without sentiment. 3 months later, she was pregnant. The court, long accustomed to whispered jokes about the king's failures, held its breath. Would this be another tragedy ending in blood and loss? On October 10th, 1830, the cannons of Madrid thundered their answer. Maria Cristina had given birth to a healthy daughter, Isabella, the future Isabella II of Spain. 2 years later, another daughter followed, Luisa Fernanda. Against all odds, Ferdinand finally had heirs. But the births carried a new complication. Spanish succession law, la ley salica, inherited from France, barred women from inheriting the throne. By law, Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos was next in line. But Ferdinand, having quite literally engineered these daughters into existence, refused to let a legal technicality strip them of their claim. In 1830, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, overturning centuries of precedent to allow his daughters to inherit. It was a decision that would not only define the final years of his reign, but plunge Spain into the blood-soaked chaos of the Carlist Wars. For Ferdinand, though, the victory was personal. After decades of humiliation, 2 dead wives, a papal intervention, and a specially measured hole in a silk cushion, he had finally done what the kingdom had demanded all along, produce an heir. What he left behind, however, was more than a succession crisis. Hidden in the cedar chest of his private chambers lay the darkest proof of his reign, the secret collection that would stain his name forever. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29th, 1833, the official mourning was dutiful but hollow. His widow, Maria Cristina, was left to navigate a political storm. Her infant daughter, now Queen Isabella II, her own position secured only by the Pragmatic Sanction Ferdinand had forced through. But before the black crepe could even be hung on the palace gates, Maria Cristina ordered a quiet, discreet search of her late husband's private quarters. What they found was not the hidden treasury of a prudent monarch, nor the sentimental keepsakes of a grieving widower. Locked inside a cedar chest, wrapped in silk and arranged with the care of a collector, were dozens of small cloth squares. Each was meticulously labeled with a date and a name, written in Ferdinand's own hand. Carmen, peasant's house, March 1821. Isabella, palace servant, January 1823. Maria, widow of Vanes, September 1824. The whispers of court, those long-standing rumors about the king's trophies, were true. Ferdinand had been keeping these blood-stained rags for nearly 2 decades, each one a memento of a virgin he had deflowered. Some willingly, many not. But the inventory revealed something darker still. The dates were not random. They clustered around moments of political violence. After every liberal uprising he crushed, after every execution he ordered, Ferdinand's collection grew. It was as if the physical destruction of his political enemies was incomplete without the sexual destruction of the women connected to them. Violence in the throne room fed violence in the bedroom. One entry froze the investigators in place. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Bermudez had been a liberal officer executed after a failed constitutional revolt. His daughter had come to the palace to beg for his life. She left with her father dead, and her own innocence taken, memorialized in a square cloth tucked away in the king's personal museum of cruelty. Maria Cristina knew what this meant. This was not merely the depravity of a lustful man. It was a systematic use of sex as a weapon of state terror. Ferdinand had turned his private vice into an extension of his political repression, crushing families not just by executing their men, but by violating their women. The Queen Regent ordered the entire collection burned, but not before several courtiers, horrified and yet compelled, committed the details to writing. Those accounts, matching almost word for word, left no doubt about the chest's existence. And yet, the question that haunts history is the one we cannot answer. For every blood-stained cloth in that chest, how many women escaped without leaving a record? How many never escaped at all? Predators do not catalog their failures. Ferdinand took those silences to his grave. His political legacy was immediate and disastrous. Don Carlos, furious at being cut from the line of succession, declared himself king and launched the First Carlist War, a civil conflict that would kill hundreds of thousands and scar Spain for generations. Isabella II inherited her father's throne, but also, it seemed, his appetites. Her own scandalous affairs and whispers of nymphomania would lead her overthrow in 1868. But Ferdinand's truest legacy was neither the war nor the throne. It was a corrosion of monarchy itself. He had transformed the Spanish crown from a sacred institution into a sordid punchline, a dynasty tainted by incest, vice, and cruelty. And perhaps the most bitter symbol of all is that lost silk cushion, an object-born necessity, designed to protect a queen from her king. In another era, it might have been preserved as a curiosity of medical history. In truth, it was a monument to everything wrong with his reign, a crown so corrupted that even the act meant to preserve the dynasty had to be engineered around a deformity, both physical and moral. Ferdinand VII wanted to be remembered as El Deseado, the desired one. History remembers him differently. As one historian wrote, cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful. Another, less restrained, called him the most contemptible of God's creatures. But even those words are too mild. For Ferdinand was not merely a bad king. He was a predator with a crown, a man who collected suffering as others collected art. And the saddest truth? His victims, their names inked on silk-wrapped cloths, remain mostly unknown. Their stories were consumed in the fire Maria Cristina ordered, their lives reduced to ash and rumor. But for those willing to look beyond the pomp and ceremony of royal history, the truth is there. Sometimes, the monsters that haunt a nation don't hide in forests or under beds. Sometimes they sit on thrones, smiling in portraits, their crimes tucked away in locked chests, until death spills them into the light.